Ladies and gentlemen, it certainly is an honor to speak in front of you today. It's an honor to be one of actually the only North American team left in today's competition. What we'd like to say, Mr. Speaker and members of this House, is that in the last couple of weeks, if you've been watching shows such bastions of journalistic integrity like Entertainment Tonight, then you know that countries like Italy have begun banning models that are too skinny from runways and fashion shows because of the unhealthy body types that they have and the social messages that they send that these unhealthy body types are what is desirable and what women should be working towards. We think in the same notion that we on the side government are happy to propose that this House would ban websites that glorify eating disorders. Our model today is fairly simple. What we would say first is that we would ban websites that positively portray unhealthy body images. Things like fashion websites that continue to have models modeling the clothing when their body mass index is something like a 4 or a 5. We would say that this happens in the first world, and that in first world regulatory commissions, like in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, which already regulates the internet in the name of children with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, these regulatory agencies are more than competent to handle this regulation. And we say, Mr. Speaker, that under this model is that the FTC is more than competent because they are the ones that already make the subjective judgments about this. So our first two arguments, what we say, is first that when governments are justified to intervene and regulate the internet, and second, the social messages that these body types portray. So first, when governments are justified to limit the internet, the first point we would say is that when there is a real risk of harm from not only the material on the internet, but also the message on the web. And this doesn't just mean the words that are printed or the pictures that are printed, but also the messages about what is desirable and the messages about what people should be working towards. It's essentially the message about what is glorified in our society. Second, we would say that when a government is justified in intervening in the internet is when this material is targeted toward a particularly impressionable group. We would say it's not just about young girls ages 14 to 22, but we'd say that is a particularly impressionable group who are subject to the psychological pressures of the social models of what they should look like. What we would say, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House, in a minute, is that when we don't regulate the internet, when the regulation is so lax, what we have are situations like when a reporter was able to buy the names and addresses of 5,000 children using the name Richard Allen Davis, a convicted child killer, for $266 on the internet with a credit card with no identification, Mr. Speaker. This is something serious. Second, the problem of the anarchist cookbook, allowing people to make bombs in their homes from regular everyday ingredients. And third, we'd say that it's justifiable because these unhealthy body types are being propagated as something that women should be working towards. Before I get on to my second point, I'll take the first person who stood up.
That would be me. Ladies and gentlemen, we set a clear standard in our society as to when we can actually curtail freedom of speech, and it's where there's a demonstrated and quantifiable link to say that this actually encourages others to cause harm to others. Can you prove that that's the case here?
We don't think it's just when it causes harm to others, but we think that it's also when those messages cause harm to individuals. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So on the issue about social messages about body types, we must recognize that even advertisers and the fashion websites and magazines like Cosmopolitan or even Dolce & Gabbana, these large, successful fashion houses, that they are intending to sell an image, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. It's not just that they're selling the clothing, it's not just that they're selling their fashion accessories, they're selling an image of who is popular and who is beautiful and what type of body you must have to be beautiful, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. And we think that this is particularly problematic on the internet because, like we said with impressionable groups, remember that the internet is quickly becoming the #1 source of media information and media exposure to teenagers and teenage women. We would say that this image is just problematic because it's simply not attainable for an average person, a regular person, Mr. Speaker and members of this House, that there is a reason that these women who are so unhealthy looking are chosen to be models, and there's a reason why the modeling industry is so exclusive. Because if you're a regular person, you just can't attain that body type. And the only way to do so, if you're going to try, is to engage in unhealthy behaviors, such as the behaviors of, or be locked into a psychological situation where you feel that you have to attain this body type to be beautiful or to be reified in your society. We think that this clearly leads to situations where women are diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, or what's oftentimes linked to it, the condition of bulimia. Now the problem here, what we say, is the issue of anorexia nervosa and bulimia. These aren't issues where women just don't eat. These aren't issues where women just make themselves throw up so that they decrease the calorie content that they're taking in a day. The problem here is that when you have anorexia nervosa so ingrained that you have situations where women are experiencing death by renal failure, that their system is just simply shut down because they don't have enough food and nutrients, and even in situations like where they don't have enough water coursing through their system to sustain them in a healthy way. Why is this a problem? Mr. Speaker, it's because, first it's a problem because we don't want them to die. But second, it's a problem because we as a society have an obligation to tell everyone that you don't have to be skinny, you don't have to be perfect to be beautiful and to be worthy of attention, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. We think that that is a situation where society has to stand up and say that it's okay to be who you are. So what have we told you? We've given you a clear model where we would ban websites that portray unhealthy body images. We've told you 2 situations when the government is justified to intervene and real harm when the government doesn't. And secondly, we've told you the social messages about body types and how this psychologically ingrains itself into the minds of particularly impressionable groups, but particularly young women. We would say for the protection of those groups, and because as a society, we don't want to say that you have to be 89 pounds to be beautiful, we're proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for his comments and now call forth the Leader Opposite.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, it's not going to work. We'll talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll pretend, ladies and gentlemen, we'll pretend that it will, because otherwise this debate is going to be remarkably short. We're going to talk firstly about internet regulation. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of anorexia and where that self-image actually comes from. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk principally about free speech and also the concept of debate, something fairly close to all of us up here, and how, ladies and gentlemen, you really can't have a debate and you really can't present your ideas effectively unless there's an opposition to point out how silly they are. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I'm going to be doing basically throughout much of my speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a talk firstly about this idea of internet regulation, because they basically stood up and said, oh yes, it's really easy, it will happen. And we think, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, just no, it's not that simple. The nature of the internet, the fact that you can have your website hosted in any country in the world, and that anyone, anywhere in the world can access it, no thank you, suggests that you're probably going to have a fairly hard time even clamping down on these kind of things, and that you are going to have these websites propagating across the world anyway, particularly, ladies and gentlemen, when you have an internet that is particularly anti-authoritarian steps, and will probably take the message that you can't do this, it's naughty, as an invitation to do it as much as they possibly can. No, thank you. But more than this, ladies and gentlemen, what exactly are the causes of anorexia? What creates this image in people's minds? Well, firstly, we say it's far, far beyond the idea that there are some skinny models somewhere on the internet. The entire of the fashion industry, the entire of the beauty industry, any advertisement for cosmetics, or practically any product related to doing with image or self-image of women, has always been about being thin. And we say, you ban size 0, there are still going to be all the size 1 models, who are also implausibly skinny for the average height and the average build of a female member of the human species. And so we say that this image, why, ladies and gentlemen, are we not banning these images in magazines? Why are we not banning them across the board if they are genuinely so pernicious? And before we come on to this question, we'll hear from Sydney.
Well, putting aside the fact this is a normative debate, in internet regulation we do this already with websites that glorify terrorism and glorify hate speech, because we believe that per se it is worth banning these things.
Well, okay, we think in any debate where you're actually trying to effect a change, if you make things worse by causing the internet community, who are notorious for standing up against you, standing up against authoritarian measures, we think that is a big problem. It's probably something that you should have thought about when you proposed it, because if you actually make the problem worse, then it's probably a bad idea. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we don't understand why you're drawing this arbitrary line, and why you're not factually focusing on all the major causes. Because for the fashion industry, there are significantly more important things that they do than just the internet. That's not the major source of their publicity, and it's certainly not the major source of the perception that is created throughout society, where people feel that they themselves are too fat, and to make a choice to try and do something about that image, no thank you, in their own mind. But more than this, ladies and gentlemen, we want to talk a little bit about the principle and the concept of free speech. Because we believe in a society that free speech is one of the important guarantors of our society. It is very, very important in a place with the idea of a marketplace of ideas, a place where you can come and have rational conversations. And we ask simply, ladies and gentlemen, what sorts of things do we make illegal? The things we make illegal generally, ladies and gentlemen, are where you are inciting things that are actual crimes, and we've yet to see a proposition stand up and tell us that being thin is a crime. And more than that, ladies and gentlemen, when we make things such as hate speech, such as incitement to religious hatred, the things that we are objecting to there, ladies and gentlemen, the things we're objecting to are the fact that we're inciting you to go and harm a third party. We accept and we recognise on this side of the House that if you wish to harm yourself, we're not very keen on your starving yourself. We don't think it's a good choice, but we recognise that it's not a crime, and if you choose to make that decision of your own will, then there's very little we can do to say that you should be prosecuted for that choice, and somebody else should be prosecuted for saying that is a valid choice that one is allowed to make in our society, because we just accept that it's a reasonable thing to do, and that isn't and has never been how free speech has ever worked before, ladies and gentlemen. So moving from this, no thank you, moving from this, we want to talk about the idea of a debate, because this is ultimately what free speech is about. We think that there is a strong and compelling case to be put forward for saying, you know what, you should think about it. You might not want to go down the path of being anorexic. Maybe you're not as fat as you think you are. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, it is well nigh impossible to have a debate. It's impossible to have a competition of ideas when one side is forbidden from speaking in that. You cannot take a viewpoint and demonstrate that that viewpoint is silly and foolish and that you should not follow that viewpoint if no one's allowed to talk about that viewpoint in the first place. Go.
But that assumes a level of rationality on the part of someone that wants to engage or is locked in a situation of anger. People are not rational.
Okay, and if they're crazy and irrational, why are they going to listen to you when they've got the fashion industry in magazines, on their TV screens, and everywhere else? We have to accept a certain standard where we can engage with these people. We don't think that they're completely crazy and beyond the pale and should be sectioned immediately and locked up for their own good, ladies and gentlemen. We think that there is a level at which we can convince them, a level at which we can reach them, and a level at which we can say to them, you know what, there is another way. And we say that you cannot have a rational debate when you've prescribed one view, because you've automatically demonized yourself as regarding the other side of that debate as so insidious and so powerful that you can't possibly let it be heard. And we say that sends a message that you're afraid of that, and you're probably afraid of it because you think that viewpoint is going to win out in a debate. We have more confidence, ladies and gentlemen. We have more confidence in the message that we are trying to send, that that message has some merits, that that message can be successful and should be listened to. And we think that they damage that, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe that they help the problem. We think they make it worse, and we think they've drawn an arbitrary distinction and rather ignored the true causes of the self-image they object to. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we take a stand for free speech, and we take a stand for actually having a debate about this and trying to help people, not shutting them away in a box and ignoring them. We beg to oppose.
Thank the Leader of Opposition, and now call forth the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thanks. I did something to show my mother. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to speak before you today. What has the opposition conceded? When they ignore Chris's points about the dangers of these self-images and how this locks women into a cycle of depression and anorexia and bulimia, they have fundamentally conceded the problem that we are dealing with. When the only harm that they provide to enacting this case is that somehow we are damaging free speech, but they don't tell us necessarily that free speech is good or how that's better than maintaining the health of women across the entire world, they have indeed conceded a solution to this problem, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to do is I want to talk about what the first opposition leader talked about, that of regulation, how this will actually work, because we think that it is working in the status quo and that we have the mechanisms to do this. Then I want to talk about the causes of this self-image and the media by which it is portrayed. Then we'll discuss free speech and debate, because I think they gain absolutely no ground. But lastly, I want to talk a little bit more about the link between these websites and the eating disorders, because I don't think that this can be emphasized enough. No, thank you. So what did we hear first from Mr. Nemo? We heard that regulation is going to be incredibly hard. That's all we heard, was that regulation was going to be incredibly hard. They never tell us how. More importantly, they never show that regulatory commissions aren't going to be able to enforce this. When Chris does a fantastic job, dare I say, brilliant job, of showing in the status quo, not only is Italy already doing this, not only is Spain already doing this, but the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States are already regulating the content of websites effectively. We would tell you this can happen, and it should happen. But more importantly, we're not going to say that we'll get every website. But for every website that we do get, that is one more negative image that we are taking away from the website, and that is one more reason for you to be proposing this motion, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing we heard was on the notion of where the self-image comes from. And Bob tells us that he's going to talk about the real reasons that anorexia exists. I didn't actually get that. What I got was that there are other media by which this is portrayed. That is, they're still going to be going on in magazines. We'd say, you're probably right, it will happen. However, this is, number one, the first step to banning this message across the board, and we should be taking that initial step. We can talk about magazines in another debate that is framed around magazines instead of websites, ladies and gentlemen. The second thing that we would tell you is when Chris talks about how the internet is growing to where it's now almost the #1 source of media information, and more importantly, it's more easily accessible to those who are of the impressionable age groups that we're talking about. That's why we start with the internet. Go ahead, madam.
Thank you very much. So people aren't anorexic because they see thin people in magazines. They're anorexic because they have a psychological disorder that makes them think they are fatter than they actually are.
You're
Other
right.
people's body image doesn't matter.
What you don't do is you don't tell us where that psychological disorder comes from. We would tell you that it comes from this media portrayal. And even if it doesn't come from it, it is reified by the media portrayal. The next thing we heard was the notions of freedom of speech. And Bob tells us that the only reason that we would ever curtail free speech is that if we incite someone to commit a crime. I don't think that's true regardless, let alone a good policy to have. First off, if we were to tell you that the only reason that we would curtail freedom of speech is that if you were to incite someone to commit a violent act or to incite someone to hurt someone else, a third party, why do we ban libel and slander, ladies and gentlemen? Those have nothing to do with the third party so much as the fact that that free speech is damaging one individual. But more importantly, they never tell us why it's good that we keep this standard. or why it's harmful if that is the standard, we happen to change that standard so that we're not damaging youth across the world. We would tell you, even if this is some advanced curtailment of freedom of speech, which, considering that it's happening all around the globe, we don't think that it is, we would tell you that that's a step that you should be willing to take. No, thank you. The last thing we heard from the opposition speakers was that the debate. That you can't have an effectual debate if you don't have both sides. Well, that's very nice to say. What we did in our model was we banned positive portrayals of these negative body images. We don't ban a website from painting this negative body image in a negative light. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that you can have both sides of the debate by saying that this is not something that you would want to do. That's what they were trying to achieve with that. But more importantly, again, they never show us why this debate is something that we need to be having, ladies and gentlemen. They never show us the benefits of this debate. And we would tell you, even if you believe in your mind, regardless of what they say, that there are benefits to this debate, the benefits of us ridding this negative image are going to far outweigh that. So let's talk lastly about the link between websites and the eating disorders. Before I do that, go ahead.
Would you ban any website that advocates doing something that might be harmful to yourself?
We believe that if we can establish a website, or if we can establish a link between the websites and actual harm caused, that yes, we should be considering that. But considering that this is so widespread, we should start here. That's another debate again, Bob. Let's talk about the link between the websites and eating disorders. Because what we've heard from side opposition is that there is no link, but they never actually show us how. I think, again, you can look back to Chris's analysis, where he tells us that these social images are actually created by the media, that they were initiated by the media, and therefore they are the root cause of this. They are the cause of these people, or they're at least allowing these eating disorders to continue, these psychological turmoil that these women have to face on a daily basis, largely for the rest of their lives, has been created by the media. At that point, you should be affirming this motion. But even if you believe that they're not the root cause of the eating disorders, what they do is they reify the eating disorders. They take those eating disorders and say that you should adopt this as well, so that you can fit into our size 0 dresses, ladies and gentlemen. They give you no other option but to accept that image, that is what is beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. What we tell you is that the websites are now becoming the #1 source of this media portrayal, and therefore this would be the legitimate area to start curtailing. So what have we shown you from the first half of proposition? We've shown you the fundamental basis by which we can curtail these websites. We've shown you the fundamental basis on which we should curtail these websites. On a principled reason, on a practical reason, ladies and gentlemen, we demand that you stop sending negative social images and ban websites that portray positively negative body types. For the second time today, we beg to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call forth the Deputy Leader opposite. Hear, hear.
I'm going to talk about 3 things. The first thing to sit on the table is the complete lunacy of this proposal. It's mad, ladies and gentlemen. The second point is to talk about the link between anorexia and these sorts of internet images. And the third point is to stand up for free speech. On the first point, this proposal is totally insane. The motion's fine because it's supposed to be about banning websites that advocate anorexia. But taking it this way is vanny, ladies and gentlemen, because what they're doing is banning thin people being portrayed as glamorous anywhere on the internet. Fashion websites, celebrity websites, pornography websites, ladies and gentlemen. That's most of the internet. To say that Italy and Spain are already doing this because they're just doing it in fashion shows hardly answers the practicality questions. Not only is the internet very capable about rooting around damage, about getting around censorship, this is the largest scale censorship project in human history, ladies and gentlemen. This is censoring hundreds of millions of images from the internet. And to say the FCC or any other internet regulatory authority has this ability is insane. Quite frankly, we think they should concentrate on cracking down on pedophilia websites, ladies and gentlemen. We think they should concentrate on cracking down on bomb recipe websites, ladies and gentlemen, on internet hackers. To say that they should spend all their time trying to shut down every website in the world that says Nicole Richie is hot is just madness. Moving on to the second point, the link between anorexia and this sort of images on the internet. Well, what we say is this link is incredibly important, because if you can't show there's a strong causative link, you really have no grounds at all to stand on in this debate. And we say these sorts of self-images aren't caused primarily from the net. The internet, they say, is important, but they gave no reason why other forms of media, such as magazines and TV, aren't in there, other than to say, well, that's another debate. Well, it's not another debate, because we think law should be consistent. We think law should be consistent, and to be consistent, you have to consider what other things you take on if you agree with the philosophy and principles of the proposition side. What's more, the link between these images and anorexia or other eating disorders is very weak. Everyone, every day, gets exposed to hundreds of images of very thin people portrayed glamorously, and the tiniest proportion of them become anorexic. The tiniest proportion. So to say that we need to act, you simply don't have the strong causal link that you need. But even if we accept this principle that they should be cracking down on free speech in some way to reduce these sorts of portrayals, even if we accept that, we say the most promising moves are to actually look at what drives this sort of self-image industry, this sort of thinness industry. And more than anything, it's the fashion industry. It's the fashion industry which sets the standards for the whole glamour business, ladies and gentlemen. It's all over the internet. And the fashion shows are the driver of the fashion industries. It's not an arbitrary choice that Spain and Italy have looked at these fashion shows. It is an arbitrary choice to look at the internet, the clothing team.
It's all well and good to rubbish images of Nicole Richie as useless, but aren't people who are psychologically predisposed to anorexic and bulimia thoughts more likely to be affected by those images and the captions?
Yes, I get your points. This is quite extraordinary, because what they're basically doing is medicalising the entire population, treating everyone as conceivably irrational or mentally ill. Let's just follow this analysis through. Some kids listened to Marilyn Manson, played Doom, and shot up a school. They were probably mentally imbalanced, at the very least irrational. Do we ban Marilyn Manson and Doom and other violent video games because of that, ladies and gentlemen? We think this is very dangerous, to shut down free speech just because a few unhinged people take it the wrong way. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of terrorists claim to be inspired by the Quran. Now that's the wrong inspiration to take from the Quran, just as I need to starve myself, it's the wrong inspiration to take from looking at a thin person. But do we shut down the dissemination of the Quran, ladies and gentlemen, because of some unhinged, irrational people taking it the same way? No, we should not medicalise the entire population, treat them as conceivably, psychologically irrational. This is a very, very dangerous road to go down. Which brings me to my third point, the point of free speech. But I'll take you first.
You're acting as if there's 5 women who are becoming anorexic from all of these websites. This isn't 2 or 3 people who shot up a school because of this. These are millions of women. And when it's that widespread, we have to do something about it.
But what we say is it is still a tiny fraction of everyone who is exposed to these images, ladies and gentlemen. So we think it's more reasonable to look at other things such as public health campaigns than to shut down the internet while at the same time not shutting down all the other sources they get of these images, the crime. Moving on to free speech. First thing I want to say within that is every example they had was speech that encouraged or enabled someone to harm others. Bomb making, pedophilia, encouraging terrorism, and so on and so forth. Libel and slander, ladies and gentlemen. Libel and slander is a harm you inflict on someone by damaging their reputation. So it's not just illegal to lie about someone, it's illegal to damage their reputation in the eyes of others. So it's still involving other people. So we say none of their analogies in any way work. They can only work if you accept this whole treat everyone as possibly irrational point. My second point is that this would lead to websites, banning websites or other forms of material presumably that advocate any sort of dangerous act. Skydiving, hill walking, ladies and gentlemen. It's absolutely ridiculous to treat people in cotton wool in this extent. This is not the sort of paternalist society we live in. Because my third point is, we believe in debate. We believe in a debate that's engaged in society. Yes, you have websites that say thin is cool, but you also have websites like the Perez Hilton gossip website, which calls celebrities out on being anorexic and makes fun of them and points out that they're not as attractive as others. That's the nature of the internet. 1,000 ideas clashing off each other in attack, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the sort of debate that will get people thinking about body image, get people thinking about anorexia. They're not shackled and forced into thinking there's only one model of beauty. There are many models of beauty, and the internet expresses all of these, ladies and gentlemen. We should not shut this down, this debate. We should not send these messages at all. We should stand up for the principles of free speech on which our societies are built. Ladies and gentlemen, we beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, call forth the Member of Government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. As closing government today, we thoroughly support the opening government's efforts to prevent unhealthy image. And what I'm going to do in my speech is do several things. Firstly, look at this issue they challenge to provide about the link of harm, Mr. Speaker, because we believe that that is the fundamental distinction which we will be able to prove that these websites do indeed not just cause harm, but in many cases set out knowingly to cause harm. And secondly, I'll look also at something new, which is a bit more analysis of why these people are particularly vulnerable. So in other words, how the harm happens and why the harm happens. But before I do that, let's look at some things we've had from the opening opposition. Because Bob got up and told us that this would just make things worse in the internet community. He didn't give us any analysis of how really it would make it worse. He didn't tell us what these people would do if the internet websites would shut down. We think that's a major flaw in his argument. He also conceded that we should ban things if they demonstrably cause harm to third parties. And what we say is that when you have a website which does encourage people who have a psychological vulnerability and a predisposition to self-harm, when you provide images which cause them self-harm, and crucially, when you know that that is what you are doing, because the entire fashion industry knows damn well that these women are vulnerable and are liable to self-harm, then what we say is that you are, with intent, providing material which will end up causing harm. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the link, and that's why this is something we should ban. No, thank you, Bob. You said you talked about anorexia, and as people have mentioned, you didn't really talk about it. We were going to look at why these websites are particularly harmful to women who are undergoing treatment for anorexia. And then this whole argument, no thanks, about free speech. You said what you love is free exchange of ideas. That's what the internet is all about. Ranel's 1,000 voices of freedom crying out in the wilderness, or whatever it was. But crucially, Mr. Speaker, we say once again, there are clear examples in society where we limit free speech. We gave them in a point of information websites which glorify terrorism and such like, and we read websites that glorify hatred, because we say that they are knowingly hoping that people will be harmed as a result of what they say, and that is a crucial example of this. So we say no, that the right to unlimited free speech is circumscribed when it will cause harm to others, and that's exactly what we're talking about in this case. So,
none of your examples are the sort of paternalistic idea that you're putting forward, that we ban speech that prevents people from harming themselves.
Well, actually, Ranald, first of all, we say that a harm is a harm is a harm. When you knowingly cause somebody to cause harm, whether it's to themselves or others, we think that's bad. But this idea that you came up with, you shouldn't medically diagnose everybody in the community. Well, no, but nor do we say that everybody in the community is liable to go out to become a terrorist, Mr. Speaker. We know that that is a very tiny minority, and yet we prevent those websites from being published because we know that harm will be caused. No, thank you. We don't believe that everybody in the world needs to be anorexic before you ban websites which encourage people to be anorexic. That's just fallacious, Mr. Speaker. So let's move on now. and look at those two links that I proposed to you. Firstly, and most crucially, this issue of knowingly causing harm. Because what we say, Mr. Speaker, is that these young women, it is after all predominantly young women, do have a fundamental vulnerability. And just by the way, when they say, oh, but you let the rest of the media do it, well, we say two things. First of all, we do regulate all other forms of media, print, visual, and so on. Anyway, and we do exactly the same there, that we don't let you publish things in newspapers and so on, of course are. And secondly, if what you want us to do is ban all these images in other publications, we might be quite happy to in another debate. We do not believe that that in any way detracts from the force of the argument that we're putting forward here, Mr. Speaker. The internet, on the other hand, is not regulated. And that's why we believe there's a deficiency. That's why we believe it is different from other forms of media. And that's why this debate is situated right here. Because what these websites do, and let's look at them, and I'll take you in a minute, Evan, is that they actively encourage women to take an unhealthy and harmful body image of themselves. So, Evan.
The only real difference to the internet and these other forms of communication is that bloggers could write into the internet talking about how disgusted they are at the body images. It's the only way we get communication and debate back into the fashion industry.
Evan, in all forms of media, there is discussion, regulated discussion, about body image. And we don't think that just because bloggers can write in and say, oh, that's an unhealthy looking picture of Nicole Richie, that you should allow people to knowingly attempt to encourage vulnerable people to cause harm to themselves. The balance of harms in that particular analysis falls quite squarely on the proposition side. Because this is the issue, Mr. Speaker. We all know that there are a number of vulnerable women who have a predisposition, psychological predisposition, to cause harm to themselves. And what we say on this side of the House is that that harm, in many cases, can be directly traced back to things like these websites, no thanks, Bob. And crucially, that the authors are very much aware of this. And we say that they know and they trade off, and the fashion industry does trade off, and so do bloggers, and so do all kinds of other websites, trade off this knowledge that these people are vulnerable. And we say that when you are taking advantage of a vulnerability in society, particularly when it is something that a lot of these people are not really able to do very much about, we say that that is something that should be regulated. We do it in lots of other examples, Mr. Speaker. We recognise the need, for example, to protect people from self-harm. We institutionalise people that we see are at risk of self-harm. We recognise that that is something that we need to protect them from. We are paternalistic and we do it again here. And now finally, Mr. Speaker, let's look at this issue of these people, why they need protection. Because let's look at a little bit of analysis which Bob didn't give us of why these people are anorexic. It's because they have a psychological disorder, Mr. Speaker. They are looking for validation from society. They're unhappy with their body image. And what do? They want to be soothed, they want to be comforted, they want to feel that they are doing the right thing. That's why they're looking for information on the internet in the first place. And we recognise, Mr. Speaker, that recovering from anorexia is a long, hard treatment process if you have body image disorder. And how do we treat anorexics, Mr. Speaker? We attempt to cut them off from negative body image, as we do with every other psychological disorder. If you have any kind of vulnerability, psychologists will attempt, first of all, to cut you off from the influences that predispose you to that disorder, and secondly, what they will do is attempt to show you that it is a disorder and that your body image, in this case, is correct. Is not correct. And how do we do that? We do that through counselling, we do that through separation from sources of information. That's why we believe in this instance that cutting them off from this particular source of information is so crucial. Mr. Speaker, we don't like people preying off vulnerability. We don't like people who knowingly cause other people to harm, whether themselves or others. That's why society bans things, Mr. Speaker, because of harms. We say ban.
I'd like to thank the Member of Government and call forth the Member of Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. The team from Alaska would like to paint us in this debate as the pro-renal failure team. What we would say is that we're not for renal failure on the opposition, we're for freedom of speech. And unless the proposition can demonstrate that these fashion websites actually cause harm, and that banning them will actually have a positive impact on the number of people who have anorexia and suffer from bulimia, we think that they don't have much of a case. Our first proposition, the lovely Bob and Ronald obviously did a brilliant job of setting up some of the principles in this debate along freedom of speech and when we can actually curtail that. What we want to give you from Queensland today is an analysis from this debate specifically within the context of the fashion industry and the positive impact that maintaining these websites can actually affect in terms of body image in our society. And I want to do that on 3 levels. Firstly, by looking at the causal link that they've asserted in this debate and whether or not that actually exists between the fashion websites and the fashion industry itself and eating disorders. Secondly, why we need this debate at all, and particularly this debate when it comes to websites and the positive impact they can have. And thirdly, the responsibilities of the state when it comes to vulnerable people, looking specifically at the difference between treating a cause and treating a symptom in our society. Because what we say on this side is if the images of thin people are going to be part of our society at all, and they haven't demonstrated that this won't be the case, we've heard that only websites where images of thin people are demonstrated without any kind of negative comment are going to be taken down. So long as there's one negative comment under their model, these websites actually remain standing. We're still going to have these images in our society. And we believe that if we're going to have these images in our society, we believe that these websites are essential to having a debate over body image in a reasoned way. But before I do that, ladies and gentlemen, I will be weaving much of my rebuttal into my substantive matter in a magical tapestry of debating. I want to talk a little bit about the other websites that we ban, coming back to rebut some of what Sam said, because we think that Ronald answered this pretty well. But there's something else to add here when we're talking about the kind of websites that we ban in terms of pedophilic rings, and in terms of terrorism and inciting terrorism. Because we say that the point they miss is that the harm isn't actually that a website incites somebody to become a terrorist. The harm is that a website incites somebody to become a terrorist and then they harm innocent people, ladies and gentlemen. The distinct difference in this case is that people are going to a website, and if they choose to go to their website themselves, they're not innocents in this particular situation, and they're making that choice themselves. We curtail freedom of speech when it hurts innocent people who haven't done anything associated with that particular act. That's why we ban it. But let's question this causal link at all, because Prop said if we can establish the link, then we win the debate. We don't think they've established the link. Sorry guys, you're not winning the debate. What we would say is that if they think there is a link, these are some incredibly powerful websites, ladies and gentlemen, and some incredibly powerful glossy magazines out there. And the point we need to appreciate here, when we're talking about people with eating disorders, is that very often they're not fashionistas. They're fitness freaks, ladies and gentlemen. They're people who want to hone their body into a particular image of what they think their body should look like. Even the thinnest models don't look like people who are suffering from the throes of anorexia and bulimia. It is entirely about their own view of themselves and their own view of the harm that it causes them. Fashion magazines didn't invent this idea of body image. What we would say from Queensland is that media is a reflection of society rather than the other way around. And what we would further say, sit down, is that the media over time changes as societal views over time change. Body image in the 1950s and 60s was your Marilyn Monroe idea, ladies and gentlemen. Very different to the kind of models that we see now. We think that what's happening in Italy and Spain is perhaps a swing back towards this. But this brings me on to my second point, and looking about why we are actually seeing a swing back towards this, and why websites are directly responsible for this swing. Because they wanted to claim the Italy example as success for their side of the debate, saying, well, they're obviously making a change, and we think that that means we need to ban websites. What they don't appreciate is that the websites are, in part, largely responsible for the fact that this change is happening at all. And I'll give you another chance to get back into the debate.
How can you claim, on one hand, that these websites are so powerful and are going to present these images regardless, and yet you can claim, on the other hand, that they're somehow going to self-censor themselves? Aren't you cancelling those arguments out?
No, mate, I'm not saying they're going to self-censor themselves. I'm saying society censors those websites with the kind of comments they post. And the thing you don't appreciate in this debate is that if you have a picture of Nicole Richie and you're not banning fashion magazines, then you will have a picture of Nicole Richie in a fashion magazine and on a website. The difference between the fashion magazine and the website is that the fashion magazines directly and in a huge, strong, authoritarian way control the caption that appears under that picture. But they don't control the caption that appears under the picture in a website in the same kind of way. Bloggers do have the opportunity to post that picture and say, we think that this is incredibly bad image. They furthermore have an opportunity to post on that website, and we think this is an incredibly bad image. And we've seen that the kind of postings on these websites, the kind of mass complaints that came through, were the reason that Italy and Spain have actually said, well, for this particular fashion shoot, for this particular fashion week, we're going to hire models who look a little bit different. What we would further say is that eating disorders are fundamentally about ignorance and about secrecy. And having these websites, and the fact that they actually go to these websites, is significantly important for addressing these problems. We've seen that the Save Mary Kate campaign that took place after images of Mary Kate were posted on websites in a positive way actually affected significant change in the minds of children around the world. Furthermore, charitable organisations are actually using these websites to put their message across in the kind of forums that exist. So long as there's a website, unlike a glossy magazine, it is always a forum for debate. Magazines are not a forum for debate, websites are. That's why Queensland is saying that we need to keep them. But let's talk finally about this issue that Sam wanted to discuss, because we think that, again, Randall covered this pretty well in saying, well, we don't ban doom because everybody's affected. But what we would say from Queensland to extend this is that we need to treat the cause, not the symptom. And by saying that fashion magazines are somehow the cause, it's completely misdiagnosing the problem. And someone with an eating disorder isn't cured when fashion magazines or fashion websites have suddenly shut down. They're cured when they can look at a fashion website and feel happy in the way that they look, or at least not so massively unhappy in the way that they look that will go and throw up, ladies and gentlemen. So by saying that websites are the problem simply misdiagnoses the problem and gives society an easy excuse to say, well, we don't need to treat this as a psychological illness. Ladies and gentlemen, what they fail to appreciate in this debate is that websites, fashion websites, give us a particular opportunity that magazines don't. They give us an opportunity to further the debate. It's why we're having the debate, ladies and gentlemen, and from Queensland, we want to continue the debate.
Thank the Member of Opposition. Call forth the Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Had Aaron not ignored us completely and our analysis and our extension and the 17-odd POIs that we offered her, we would have answered very simply to her question about causation. We say yes, the media didn't create body images, but the KKK didn't invent racism. We still don't let them plaster it all over the internet. And that's the very simple answer to the question of horse and cart, and that's what we'll get to by the end of this speech. Because what I want to do is I want to look at exactly what we brought to the floor about who these people are and what it is about the specific nature of the internet that causes harm to these people and how these images actually do that. After that, I'll come back to these silly questions about whether or not we can regulate. What we got from the first speaker of the opposition was that you have the right to harm yourself and the state doesn't stop it. It's not a crime not to eat. We say that's absolute bollocks, Mr. Speaker. We institutionalise anorexics because they harm themselves by not eating. There are a number of states in the world who recognise the right of the state to force feed anorexics because they are doing harm to themselves. And we don't have to defend that extreme in today's debate, but we're fully prepared to defend the right of the state to prevent people from doing harm to themselves when it's perfectly easy for the state to do so. Because what we got throughout Erin's speech, and even throughout the opening half, was this isn't a case of the website harming you. We only ban things when a website causes someone else to harm you. And we ask why the distinction that it's not okay for a middleman to harm you, but it's perfectly alright if the website does it in and of itself. Because what we say is that the website, the author of the website, harms their audience by encouraging them to enact or act in a certain manner. In the exact same way that the KKK's website harms a third person by encouraging their audience to act in a certain way. And we say the fact that enacting that doesn't harm the third party but simply the individual doesn't escape the three-pronged principle of harm in society, that we ban things when they harm individuals, we ban things when they harm others, and we ban things when they harm society at large. And we say there's absolutely no differentiation in this case between harming a third party or directly harming the person who reads the site. I'm not taking Erin, she ignored us.
Okay, I see a website, I climb a mountain and due to some poor advice fall off and die. That's a harm.
The website didn't tell you to jump off the mountain. That's the difference. What we brought to you in this debate was that we have to look at who these people are that are viewing these images, and the people viewing these images who are dangerous. Because I'm not suggesting every woman who reads a fashion magazine is. But what we talk about in those three-pronged principle of harm is this. There are people in society who are predisposed to harm in this case. And we said that people are predisposed to harm when they have limited agency and when they have inhibited capacity. And we say that occurs in this case very simply by the fact that these people aren't in full control of all of their actions. We're not saying they're completely irrational, but we say when people have a psychological need to justify their body image and justify their self-opinion of themselves and try and find both visual images and blogs which encourage and justify the exact same thing, then we say those people have limited agency and have limited capacity to judge those images for themselves. Because what Sam brought to this debate is that people looking at these images are people who don't feel comfortable with their place in society. And we say that when these people don't feel comfortable with their place in society, what they're looking for is a picture or a blog or an opinion which justifies that opinion by showing them the perfect part of society and exactly what they're not and exactly what they're petrified of not looking like. What you're giving them is the absolute justification of their feelings of insecurity and their feelings of inadequacy. And what's the harm there? And I'll take the second half in a minute, even though they were pricks. And this is it. Firstly, it perpetuates their activity of feeling insecure because you show them exactly what they're not and you show them exactly what they want to be. Secondly, you actively prevent them from seeking help because by looking at that website, they don't feel like those feelings are somehow wrong. They feel that those feelings are understandable and natural when you look at the people in society who are popular and you look at the people in society who do get attention. Thirdly, it undermines efforts by health services to speak to these people because you flood their images with beautiful people rather than with healthy, normal-looking individuals.
You told us that Bob's website wasn't to blame because it didn't tell him to jump off the mountain. There's no intent here with fashion websites and they have further benefits.
That's false. The fashion industry tells women that they're ugly all the time with the intent of selling things. That's why anti-aging products exist. That's why they always talk about diet pills and advertise them on the same website that they show little black dresses, Mr. Speaker. What we say very clearly in this question of whether or not you can regulate is of course you can. We showed you that you can regulate hate websites, terror websites. You can even prevent people from online gambling. We never heard why it was that you can't do that in this particular case. As for it'll get worse, I'm not quite sure the underground argument works on the internet. So let's leave that one well alone. What we did get in engagement on this was that the Deputy Opposition Leader, and I'm giving you a little credit, was right that he said we don't curtail agency unnecessarily. It is a case where society balances the benefit of that activity to individuals versus the harm it causes to others. The very first thing we'd say is you're defending an incredibly low benefit. We don't think that fashion magazines provide such a benefit to society that they have to be held even when they cause harm to a huge number of people. It's not a particularly high value, particularly when you see that 62% of American high school girls admit to having negative body image thoughts on a daily basis. These are the exact same people who are looking at this website, trying to fit into a little black dress, seeing the perfect picture of themselves that they're not, and being advertised for diet pills and diet shakes at the same time. And we say that's where the harm's caused, and we say that outweighs any particular benefit of selling more Gucci dresses or selling a little more oil of Olay. And then we come to this question of sunlight being the best defence for evil thoughts, and this question of blogs. We were hoping that was the whole debate. We're glad that it actually came into the debate. Because we say that the problem with blogs is that there's that we have absolutely no authority on the authorship. That as much as you can say, there are blogs saying, oh my God, isn't Nicole Richie ugly? Every other website is, oh my God, Paris Hilton's hot. I want to her. And that's the question that we have in today's debate about why they're prepared to leave women in a vulnerable position, protected only by people who are willing to post comments in return from an anonymous blog as some kind of societal defence against a scourge that we've shown you is ravaging young women. We say that we balance harms when agency isn't fully protected. We say in this case, as an agency deficit, the state should act to protect young women.
I'd like to thank the Government Whip and invite forward the Opposition Whip.
Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a bad person, but I think if Robert would stop thinking with this prick, he might have had more impact on this debate. Now, what I want to bring to this debate is an analysis of the three major issues. The first thing that we want to talk about is the role of government in censorship. When does government censor things and why? Secondly, let's talk about the actual effect on eating disorders on people who have eating disorders. And thirdly, let's talk about freedom of speech and open debate, an issue which not many people really want to talk about, especially from the bench on this side of me, but which Erin nailed quite well. So let's talk about the role of government in censorship. We've had a lot of analogies, we'll have a lot of talk about those analogies. I'm going to make it very, very clear for you. The fact is, it was revealed both through their points of information and through the analysis that we especially had for the second half, why there's a big logical fallacy with the way in which the proposition have been arguing this debate. Because they've simply forgotten the idea of intent, or they've assumed intent when there's no way that it could actually exist in this case. We're not talking about Osama bin Amani here. This is not somebody that sits there with his web of cellular, like terrorist structures and plots the demise of young women through extensive throwing up. This is no intent here on the part of the fashion magazines, no thank you, to make more people bulimic or to make more people anorexic. In every one of the analogies that we had from the proposition, that is exactly the difference. Because with the terrorist website, guess what guys, there is an intent that harm will be caused to people, no thank you, by terrorists and by the people around them. With pedophilia rings, there is an intent that pedophilia will take place. With hate speech, there is an intent when it's inciting harm, that harm is done. No thank you. There is no intent here. It is a byproduct, and it's a byproduct that we don't necessarily think there is a great causal link. So to say that Armani and Versace are out to get people that might be bulimic, or people in the future might be anorexic, is both A, ridiculous, and B, completely undermines their attempted analysis on what the role of government in censorship is. No thank you. The next major issue that we have to talk about in this debate is the actual effect on eating disorders, and I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on this. No, I won't take you for, we'll see how it goes. The first thing is, how much does the fashion industry actually cause people to have eating disorders? And we actually had very little analysis on this. We had a lot of assumptions, and Erin's already dealt with that, and we didn't have them come back from this at all. And it will take the second half on this one.
So, the aim of these fashion websites is an intent to make women feel insecure about their bodies so that they buy the products. When you know that a large number of women have a psychological predisposition to that vulnerability, that's intent to harm.
No, that's just ridiculous. The intent of these websites is to sell clothes and thinner women because other women find them more attractive and because men find them more attractive, sell more clothes. But the fact is, and this is what I wanted to get to, anorexic women no one finds attractive. Bulimic women, if they get that thin, nobody finds attractive. The point that you've missed here, and the reason why the analysis that Erin brought us about the nature of eating disorders is quite important in this debate is, the vast majority of these models are not anorexic necessarily, they're not bulimic necessarily, and they do not have the body type that we're actually talking about when we're talking about mental disorders. So, when we can see that the difference lies in the actual perception of the individual, don't have a right to take away the ability, no thank you, of thin women to wear dresses on a website because other people think that they are fatter than that, when in reality they are actually already thinner than that, because that is what is taking place here. So what did we hear from the second half? We heard that this is about women undergoing treatment already, no thank you, because it's about their ability to see these websites on the internet and this would affect their treatment. Well, they already admitted as part of that point that part of that treatment is that they wouldn't be seeing these on the internet, and we think that that's a more appropriate, no thank you, role of government to stop people that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder from seeing things that might hurt that mental disorder, not to stop the rest of the community from shopping for clothes on the internet because other people have a mental disorder. No thank you. When we talk about the general community, those that don't necessarily have the eating disorder already, apparently 62% of girls that have some kind of problem with their body image in schools. The fact is, and we never had a causal link here, mostly they're comparing themselves to each other. They're going to be comparing themselves to what they see on television and in glossy magazines. We appreciate that the basic flux of their case says that if they could, they'd also like to ban some things here. But the problem is they can't necessarily ban these glossy magazines. They can't ban the media from portraying thin people as being hotter than people that are not so thin. So when you can have a constant inundation of exactly the type of media attention that they say causes this, and you're only blocking one avenue for that media, all you're doing is having absolutely no impact. Because even if you stopped all the media from saying that women in general are hotter when they're thinner, it's exactly no thank you what takes place on the playground for 14 to 18-year-old girls. You're not going to stop the societal harm. What we can do, no thank you, and this is another thing that Erin brought to the debate, is we can accept that part of the treatment for anorexics and people with bulimia is that they can talk to other people that they think are thinner than them, no thank you, and they can view websites, and they can read glossy magazines with thin fashion models without thinking that they are in fact fatter than those people, no thank you, when they are in fact thinner than those people. That is part of the treatment. And to attempt to cut them off from the influence here is not going to help them in any way. But what might help them? We have to ask ourselves why we're having this debate in the first place, why Spain and Italy have started to change some of their decisions about runway models and about their body image. And Erin has already given you this analysis. The reason we're having this debate is because of the immense amount of debate and communication that is taking place on the internet as we speak. So we have to look at where the actual harm is. When we're still going to get the glossy magazines with the thin models, when we're still going to get the media attention, and where girls are still going to compare themselves to each other in school, we need to keep the one avenue where, for every website that's set up by a fashion magazine, we have countless other websites going against that body image, talking about how women should not necessarily look that way. And there's communication between those websites, counter-blogging, counter-blogging. I would go so far as to say immense bitch fights between these websites. So when you have that level of communication and that level of debate, that's why we have freedom of speech.